The Mind of a Monster, Understanding Adolf Hitler, read and published by Mr. Books. History is a scar across the collective human soul, a wound never entirely healed, but kept alive as a warning. In those scars, no name echoes louder, nor more chillingly than Adolf Hitler. The world has tried, time and again, to make sense of this man, a single individual whose mind, roiling with dark ambitions and twisted visions, unleashed a tempest that drowned millions in an ocean of blood and fear. But what truly creates a monster? Is it the boy, wounded and adrift in a world that denied him? Or the young man, simmering with resentments and rejections, who sought solace in the arms of a pernicious ideology? Perhaps it is the mythic leader, sculpted by fate and circumstance, who discovers his own hunger for power outweighs any conscience. In the pages that follow, we endeavor not to excuse or soften, but to confront, to gaze into the abyss and understand what stared back. This book is not an endorsement, but an autopsy. We probe the psyche of Adolf Hitler, peeling back the layers of legend, propaganda, and horror to peer into the core of a human being who seeded violence with words and harvested genocide with policy. It is not enough for us to call him monster and close the book. We owe it to every victim, every survivor, and every future generation to know how and why such darkness can take hold. Only then can we truly say, never again. Through 8 chapters, we journey from the cracked pavement of Hitler's childhood to the marble floors of the Reich Chancellery, from the fevered mind of the artist shunned to the unyielding grip of the Führer on world history. We shall stand in the shadows of his formative years, peer into the flames that forged his hate, and listen with horror and heartbreak to the symphony of destruction he composed. The Mind of a Monster is not only the product of one life, but of 1,000 moments, the kindnesses withheld, the hatreds nursed, the failures that fermented into rage. In understanding Adolf Hitler, not to justify, but to dissect, we hold a mirror to the darkness in ourselves and resolve anew to recognize the warning signs before they once again become the thunder of armies and the cry of innocence. Let us begin this difficult journey. Darkness awaits, but only by confronting it can we hope to overcome. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now, let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1. Shadows of Innocence, Hitler's Early Years. It is a cold winter in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town nestled on the banks of a frozen river. Here, on April 20, 1889, a child is born, a boy like countless others, mewling and dependent, utterly incapable of fathoming the future that awaits him. No star in the night sky marks the arrival of Adolf Hitler, yet, even in infancy, fate's shadow gathers over the small, unremarkable house belonging to Alois and Clara Hitler. In the years that follow, the home is turbulent. Alois, the patriarch, is a man shaped by discipline and frustration, a customs official whose rigid demands and fierce temper cast long shadows over his children. For young Adolf, affection is rare, replaced by the heavy footfall of authority. Alois is a thorn in his son's side, a constant reminder that the world is cold, unforgiving, and dictated by those with the power to command. In contrast, Clara is a gentle balm, warm, nurturing, her hands calloused by care and heartbreak. To Adolf, she is everything softness should be, yet her love is not enough to muffle the storms that so often rage in the home. School brings no solace. A sickly child, Adolf is removed from class for long stretches, illnesses breaking the rhythm of his tenuous childhood. When he returns, he is different, quieter, more watchful. He immerses himself in the world of books, particularly drawn to stories of Germanic heroes and the grandeur of lost empires. In classrooms, where others are content to learn their sums and their letters, Adolf dreams of greatness, of conquering the insignificance that haunts his days. But family life is a pressure cooker. Alois's expectations loom large. A career as a civil servant is planned. The boy's creative yearnings, especially his burgeoning interest in art, are crushed under the heel of paternal scorn. Yet, like a seed forced into rocky ground, Adolf's ambitions do not wither, only twist. His sketchbooks become secret sanctuaries, filled with grand cityscapes and bold strokes that betray a longing for significance. He finds beauty not only in art, but in the idea of being seen, recognized, rescuing himself from the shadows of mediocrity that stalk his early life. The household is shaken by loss. Adolf's younger siblings perish young, and each coffin seems to etch another line of sorrow into Clara's face. For Adolf, the deaths are lessons in impermanence, a world that gives and takes with equal brutality. Grief becomes a familiar guest, shaping the emotional landscape of a boy who learns early that nothing is certain, and that love, when it fades, leaves only emptiness in its wake. In these formative years, seeds are sown. A child misunderstood, overlooked, buffeted by forces beyond his control, begins to weave a bitter tapestry of resentment and ambition. He fixates on the concept of destiny, intoxicated by stories of struggle and triumph, increasingly convinced that his own suffering is not only unique, but a sign of greater purpose. He becomes adept at adaptation, performing obedience to Alois when necessary, fleeing into daydreams when hardship proves too heavy to bear. Yet, if the pains and disappointments of Hitler's youth were all that shaped him, he might have become nothing more than another unhappy man in a world of the same. But in the crucible of early loss and longing for validation, a peculiar energy begins to stir. Not content to simply endure, this child begins to imagine himself as the author of fate rather than its victim. Fueled by thwarted artistic dreams and a growing sense of alienation, Adolf's interior world becomes a cauldron, a mix of grievance, fantasy, and the first faint flickers of megalomania. The streets of Linz, where the family eventually settles, are haunted places for the adolescent Adolf. Here, diversity is painted as danger, and prejudices pass as common wisdom. He listens and absorbs. The loneliness and disaffection that color his world blend seamlessly with the dangerous demagoguery simmering in Viennese society. Anti-Semitic pamphlets, grandiose operas glorifying ancient heroics, and the relentless march of German nationalism all find fertile ground in the young man's psyche. As Alois's health fails and death finally claims him, young Adolf is released from domestic tyranny. But he carries the wounds and the lessons about power, about the fragility of love, about the attention that comes from causing pain. Clara's own decline, suffering from breast cancer, becomes Adolf's first real taste of helplessness and sorrow. Her eventual death is the breaking point. His last link to unconditional love is gone. Orphaned, poor, wounded, and desperate, he stands at the edge of adulthood with nothing but himself to trust. What emerges from this crucible is not yet the monster of history books, not yet the architect of genocide. But the patterns are there, pain unexamined, ambition unchecked, wounds left to fester into grievance. The boy from Brno wanders uncertainly into the world, a storm gathering beneath soft, unremarkable features. Shadows stretch long across history, and as we follow Hitler's early years, we glimpse the agony and fury already stirring beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when circumstance and desire would intersect and the mind of a monster would begin to take shape. Chapter 2. Forged in Fire: The Evolution of a Fanatic. The years that follow Hitler's uncertain departure from childhood are defined by drift, a wanderer's hopeless gaze, punctuated by defeat, and self-deceit. Vienna, the city of dreams and disasters, looms on the horizon, a glittering imperial metropolis, surely the crucible where ambition and artistry might finally meet. For the adolescent Adolf, Vienna is more than a city. It is the shimmering hope of transcendence, the place he might shed his disappointments and emerge reborn. But Vienna has little patience for dreamers without means. Rejection comes swift and sharp. The Academy of Fine Arts assesses Hitler's hopeful portfolio and finds it lacking. Twice, he is denied entry. The blows are devastating, and with each, a well of resentment grows. The city he so longed to call home feels cold and unyielding. His art, his one true lifeline, is not enough. He is not enough. The wounds of paternal disappointment are reopened, deeper than before. He scrapes by painting postcards and laboring in menial jobs, his hopes dissolving in the shadows of coffeehouses and homeless shelters. Vienna pulsates with the contradictions of modernity, spectacle and poverty, grandeur and decay, enlightenment and bigotry. For Hitler, the streets are as much a classroom as the ones he abandoned only here. The lessons are steeped in bitterness. Anti-Semitic voices ring loud in the city's papers and politics, and Hitler listens with growing fascination to the rhetoric of hatred and suspicion. He learns the language of blame, of scapegoating, folds these doctrines into the wounds of his past. His failures are recast, not as marks of his own inadequacy, but as crimes of outsiders, forces he convinces himself are arrayed against the righteous. Through these years, a crucial metamorphosis occurs, a transformation from isolated artist to seething ideologue. The city, which could have been a birthplace of beauty, instead becomes a forge for fanaticism. Hunger mixes with humiliation. The hard faces of bureaucrats and the cold indifference of passers-by deepen Hitler's sense of being unseen, unwanted. Yet, amid this gloom, his dreams do not die, they mutate. Unloved, unvalued, he seeks worth not in acceptance, but in opposition. The First World War erupts, and with it comes the promise of escape, meaning, and perhaps greatness. Hitler, now rootless and without ties save his bitterness, volunteers for the Bavarian army. War, from the safe distance of youth, is an intoxicant, the ultimate reckoning, where fates are decided and cowards separated from heroes. In battle, Hitler finds something like belonging, a regiment to march with, a nation to bleed for. He receives medals, wounds, camaraderie. For the first time in his life, he is part of something larger, no longer the outcast, but the defender of a cause. The price of this belonging is steep. The Western Front is a charnel house. The air is thick with mud, mustard gas, and the screams of the dying. But for Hitler, war is not a descent into hell, but an awakening. It is order, predictability, and purity of purpose. With every bombardment, his sense of mission is reinforced. As Germany ultimately falters and is driven to defeat, a new agony is born within him. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles is, to Hitler, not merely a national humiliation, but a personal betrayal. He imbibes the poison of stab in the back myths, feeding off the idea that a conspiracy of traitors, Jews, socialists, weak-willed politicians has undone the valor of the soldier. The seeds sown in the darkness of Vienna now sprout. Hitler, like so many before him, might have faded into obscurity, another casualty of fractured ambition, another victim of invisible wounds. But history, ever ironic, sometimes favors the most unthinkable candidates. Germany in the 1920 SE is ripe for demagogues, broken, starving, its defeated people searching desperately for meaning. In beer halls and public rallies, Hitler finds his stage. Words leap from his lips like daggers, filled with venom, but also with strange, seductive energy. The crowd's first a handful, and then thousands lean in, mesmerized. It is here, in the embers of post-war chaos, that fanaticism becomes mission. Hitler is no longer content to be swept along by history. He will shape it. The victimhood that marked his childhood becomes a weapon, wielded at every podium. He crafts a narrative in which Germany's suffering mirrors his own, and in which he alone possesses the will and vision to redeem both. His oratory is raw and elemental, a force that stirs the collective grief and rage of a scarred nation. He splices his personal narrative with the wounds of his listeners. Every loss, every humiliation, becomes another stone in the edifice of hate he builds. To those grasping for certainty in a world shattered by war, Hitler's certainty becomes salvation, his rage, a rallying flag. But even as his following grows, so too does the darkness within. The more he speaks, the more he believes, and the more he believes, the less tethered he becomes to compassion or doubt. The world narrows, enemies are caricatured, complexity flattened. The human being recedes, overtaken by the fanatic, the self-appointed savior, convinced that only through struggle and violence can destiny be fulfilled. The evolution from boy to ideologue is not inevitable, but it is tragic in its milestones. We see a mosaic of insecurities, vanities, wounds, and then a decisive turn as hunger for validation morphs into a hunger to command. In the forging fires of Vienna's rejection and the trenches of the Western Front, the mind of a would-be monster is battered, shaped, and finally cast in the crucible of hate. Chapter 3. Seeds of Hate, the Roots of an Ideology. No monster is born in isolation. The soil in which hate festers is fertilized by history, poisoned by prejudice and watered with lies. For Adolf Hitler, the narrative he would craft one that contorted Germany's pain into a clarion call for persecution and power was not spun from his mind alone. It was the product of centuries-old toxins that had seeped into the very marrow of European culture. In pre-war Vienna, the anti-Semitism that defined Hitler's later life was omnipresent. It curled through the streets, masquerading as enlightened debate in salons, or as crude caricature in popular theater and pamphlet. Anti-Jewish sentiment had economic, religious, and pseudo-scientific roots, and Hitler, desperate to explain the fractures in his own world, inhaled these hatreds greedily. The city's mayor, Karl Lueger, became a model, a populist, who thrived on finding scapegoats for social problems and wielding resentment as a tool for power. Hitler took note not only of the rhetoric, but of the results, how division could rally support, how blame could breed fervor. Yet, the roots of Hitler's ideology extended deeper than the present. The specter of German nationalism haunted the 19th and early 20th centuries. A pan-Germanic longing, a yearning for unity, purity, and greatness permeated the culture, especially in the aftermath of rapid modernization and the anxieties it provoked. Hitler gravitated to these myths, the fairy tales of his childhood, the operas of Wagner, and the histories to which he clung all spoke of lost glory and eternal enemies. It was easy then to take the step from wounded pride to blood and soil dogma. After the devastation of World War I, the soil was newly tilled for hatred. Poverty and humiliation ran rampant through Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was a bitter draught. Through propaganda and rumor, defeat was transformed from the result of battlefield dynamics into a narrative of treachery. Judenpresse, Jewish press, international finance, Marxist agitators, all became convenient synonyms for betrayal. Hitler's worldview hardened, calcified into a set of prejudices that could not be reasoned with, only shouted louder or enforced with violence. His reading, too, shaped him. Pseudo-scientific racial texts, the works of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and others lent a twisted legitimacy to Hitler's beliefs. These tracts argued that history was not shaped by ideas or reforms, but by racial struggle, corruption, economic malaise, and political chaos were seen not as the result of complex social forces, but as symptoms of racial decline. Hitler, looking for an explanation for both his own failures and those of his beloved Germany, swallowed these claims whole. In chapter after chapter of Mein Kampf, Hitler would later draw these lines with fanatic precision. Jews, communists, and racial inferiors were not simply groups of people to him. They were existential threats, embodied enemies to be purged in the name of a perverted ideal. The roots of this ideology were watered by his diverse collection of grievances, but they were not his alone. By appealing to shared pain, by recasting Germany's losses as evidence of conspiracy, Hitler built bridges into the collective psyche, a psyche primed by decades of loss, dislocation, and prejudice. It is crucial, in understanding the mind of this monster, to recognize that Hitler did not invent hate. He amplified inherited hatreds, recast them in melodramatic tones, and used them as the foundation of a new apocalyptic vision. He borrowed the language of myth, the rhythms of Wagner, the dark fantasies of racial purity, and wove them into a tapestry intended to inspire and terrify, a tapestry on which he painted himself as both savior and executioner. Yet, beneath the venomous language and grandiose pronouncements, there was always fragility, a narcissistic wound that sought healing through domination. Hitler's ideology was never about service or reform. It was about revenge against those who had denied him a place in the world, personally and nationally. Every speech, every policy, every act of brutality was a twisted attempt to rebalance the scales, to stamp out weakness, ambiguity, and the pain he had suffered. The seeds of hate fell on fertile ground, and by the early 1920s, what had begun as a private catalogue of grievances had become a coherent and deadly ideology. The monster's mind was now entwined with the world's wounds. In his hands, hate was transformed from feeling to weapon, wielded with a terrifying conviction that reshaped not only one man's life, but the destiny of an entire continent. Chapter 4. The Painter's Canvas, Formation of Obsession. Long before the uniforms and the staged rallies, before the violence that would scar a century, Adolf Hitler was a boy with pencils and dreams. In these years, those fragile, uncertain days of adolescence and early adulthood, art was refuge, and obsession was the color he painted with most. Art, for Hitler, was not merely escape, but a first glimpse of transcendence, a hint at another self beyond the shadows of his father's ire and poverty's stigma. He spent hours hunched over makeshift desks, drawing cities teeming with order and majesty, lines always straight, buildings proudly severe. His Vienna was a fantasy of immensity and structure, each boulevard and column a whispered prayer for meaning in a world that felt as if it were built to exclude him. His every artistic effort was, at its heart, an attempt to claim a place in history, not only through talent, but through vision. His heroes were architects, city planners, and visionaries who shaped chaos into purpose. The great citadels of Vienna, the opera houses, the monuments all signified to Hitler the possibility of immortality through creation. Yet, his artistry was always deemed inadequate. Each rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts became another profound wound. Rejection was not just of his art, but of his very self. The world's dismissal of him as an artist reinforced an already brittle sense of identity, driving him further into obsession. In retrospect, we realize that Hitler's passion for art and order would bleed into his politics in monstrous ways. The dream of grand avenues and monumental structures became, in power, the fantasy of a racially pure, tightly controlled country. The need for validation, born in front of empty sketchbooks and cold examiners, metastasized into a hunger for absolute affirmation, a praise which one's mind could only find in adoration and domination. Obsession, after all, is a double-edged sword. For the artist, it can be the fuel that pushes craft to new heights. For the ideologue, it can become the poison that blinds to the suffering of others. Hitler's notebooks and cityscapes were not simply juvenile pursuits, but the early blueprints of a mind desperate to impose order on a chaotic, disappointing world. He clung to the certainty and clarity of lines drawn by his hand. This need for order soon spilled into every corner of his worldview. Life, with its ambiguities and contradictions, was intolerable. Only through control of people, of culture, of fate, could he find meaning. This was not the dispassionate order of the engineer, but the feverish drive of the obsessive, a man determined to stamp out chaos, difference, and doubt wherever he found it. The obsession deepened as personal failure mounted. Rejected as an artist, Hitler drifted on the margins of society. Yet, he never relinquished his sense of destined greatness. He began to mythologize his own life as suffering, misunderstood genius, misunderstood by the masses, a man apart. As the years passed, this myth hardened into a granite-like self-belief. Hitler became his masterpiece, a figure whose suffering justified cruelty, whose vision excused fanaticism. Thus, the painter's canvas became the dictator's blueprint. The hunger to create became the hunger to command. When Hitler would later demand the modernization of Berlin and the construction of monstrous new boulevards, he was not simply building cities, he was building monuments to his wounded ego, exorcising the ghosts of rejection with every stone and slogan. In seeking to master the world, Hitler ultimately reflected his interior desolation, his inability to live with open uncertainty, his terror of being ordinary or forgotten. Obsession, unchecked by compassion or humility, can become its brand of madness. For Hitler, the dream of beauty would become the nightmare of control, the painter's longing for recognition evolving, forever haunted, into the architect of ruin. Chapter 5. Becoming the Emperor, Hitler's Rise to Power. Cries echoed across the beer halls of Bavaria, mingling with the scent of smoke and stale hope. In these dimly lit chambers, Adolf Hitler found his voice, a voice that would transfix a broken nation. He was neither a nobleman, nor a war hero, nor a scholar or philosopher. He arrived as an outcast, steeped in disillusionment, haunted by the humiliation of defeat, and burdened by the bitterness of a lost generation. But here, in the fervor of post-war Munich, he discovered the intoxicating alchemy of power. The path to the Emperor was not forged overnight. It was the product of years of failure, tenacity, manipulation, and luck. Germany in the 1920s was fertile ground for extremists. Inflation eroded savings, unemployment corroded dignity, and democratic institutions seemed too fragile for a population desperate for certainty. Against this backdrop, Hitler, a man with no significant achievements, stood resolute, casting himself as the herald of redemption. His true genius, if it can be called that, was his ability to sense and exploit the cravings of the masses. He channeled their anger, promising to restore lost greatness, to find scapegoats for their pain, and to speak truths too dark for others to utter. In the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, Hitler's talents found their crucible. With mesmerizing oratory and ruthless discipline, he transformed a fringe group into a political machine. The failed beer hall putsch in 1923 was a crucible. Paradoxically, his imprisonment after the coup attempt became a blessing. Behind bars, he penned Mein Kampf, a manifesto of hate that, though chaotic, crystallized his worldview. Upon his release, the seeds he sowed in prison began to sprout. He revised tactics, pursuing power not by force, but through the very system he reviled. Propelled by economic disaster and a public, desperate for radical solutions, the Nazi Party swelled. The streets thrummed with brown-shirted stormtroopers, their boots marking the arrival of a new order. Hitler projected an image both populist and mystical. The humble veteran, the fatherly protector, the iron-willed visionary. Step by step, he dismantled opposition through propaganda, intimidation, and calculated alliances with conservative elites who hoped to control him. The tipping point. A fragile republic, already teetering, capitulated. Backdoor deals and political intrigue elevated Hitler to chancellor. The rest, as they say, is history, but a history of blood and betrayal. Once inside the machinery of government, Hitler moved with ruthless precision. The Reichstag fire became the pretext for emergency powers, and with a stroke of a pen, democracy died. The Enabling Act placed absolute authority in his hands. From the ashes of chaos, the Führer emerged a self-styled messiah with unchecked control over Germany's destiny. Yet behind the bombast was a soul shredded by insecurity. He was obsessed with performance, always calculating image over intimacy, wielding paranoia against friend and foe alike. The joy on the faces of adoring crowds masked a private torment, a leader forever haunted by the possibility of betrayal, a charlatan who knew the fragility of his myth. His path to power was paved not just by his ambition, but by a society complicit in its delusion. Hitler's rise was an indictment of collective yearning for certainty over freedom, a warning of what happens when fear is stronger than reason. Every step, from failed putsch to Chancellor's office, was both a triumph of will and a catastrophe of conscience. As the night of the long knives fell and Hitler purged real and imagined enemies, the last remnants of resistance were crushed. The world stood astonished, some appalled, some approving, as a nation surrendered its soul to one man's darkness. The Führer was born a monster, cloaked in the dreams of millions, leading them and the world to the brink of the abyss. Chapter 6. Dark Machinations Inside the Nazi Mind. To understand the monster, one must chart the machinery of his obsessions. The inner circle of Nazi power was not an impersonal bureaucracy. It was a feverish cult, one fueled by loyalty, secrecy, and the intoxicating allure of absolute control. Adolf Hitler stood at its epicenter, his will the warp and weft of the Nazi mind. The world saw processions, uniforms, and flags, a theatrics of order. But beneath this armor, the regime was a labyrinth of competing ambitions and constant paranoia. Hitler encouraged rivalry among his lieutenants, Göring, Himmler, Goebbels. They vied for favor, dreadfully aware that approval today could be condemnation tomorrow. Loyalty was currency, and fear its shadow. Hitler's worldview, born of personal trauma and warped ideology, infused every policy, every order. At the heart of the Nazi mind was a burning mythos: Germany, pure and eternal, endangered by internal traitors and external enemies. Racism was not a means to an end. It was the very foundation of the Reich reality, stripping millions of their humanity in the service of purification. The world was organized into hierarchies, strong over weak, Aryan over all. In the cabinet meetings of Berlin and the twilight conversations of the Berghof, Hitler's word was law. His moods determined lives. Advisors came with ideas and left with edicts. Sometimes whole policies were born in the fever of a night's rant. Intellectuals and generals bowed, some enthusiastically, many cynically, but none could escape the gravity of his obsession. The machinery beneath him was horrifying in both scope and detail. The elaborate system of surveillance, managed by Himmler's SS-stoked fear among millions. The Sippenhaft guilt by family association ensured no one felt safe. Propaganda, orchestrated by Goebbels, was not merely information, it was the architecture of unreality. The German people did not so much believe as they were told what to believe, until the distinction itself dissolved. Yet for all the outward unity, Hitler's court was a nest of intrigue and self-destruction. Decisions were made in isolation, policies declared in fits of inspiration or rage. His officials scrambled to interpret his contradictory dictates, fearful of disapproval, repurposing failures as secret successes. This chaos served a purpose. It centralized power in the hands of a leader who trusted no one, not even himself. At the heart of the Nazi mind were delusions of grandeur, shadowed by constant dread. Hitler dreamed of empire, a 1,000-year Reich, while obsessed with omens, astrology, and the purity of bloodlines. He sought to eliminate weakness, purging the party, the government, even the ranks of his military. Treachery was expected. Loyalty was a performance, not a virtue. And all around, the machinery worked, children indoctrinated, neighbors reporting on neighbors, Jews and undesirables catalogued for extermination. Bureaucrats, engineers, doctors and soldiers became cogs in a death machine, so intricate it would terrify the world for generations to come. Inside the Nazi mind was a war against reality, a toxic fantasy, policed by terror and fueled by the dark charisma of a man who mistook his hatreds for destiny. What began as a series of speeches in smoky bars had become the most nightmarish system of control the modern world had ever known. Yet its engines ran not only on violence, but on a terrible complicity, the willingness of millions to look away, to obey, and to believe. Chapter 7. The Abyss of Evil, Decisions that Shaped History. The true measure of evil is not its intent, but its consequence. For Adolf Hitler, monumental decisions did not come with the gravity of responsibility. They came dressed in the conviction of inevitability. The abyss into which he led the world was built, brick by brick, on choices both cynical and fanatical. With power consolidated, Hitler set about remaking Germany, then the world, in his image. The Nuremberg laws marked the first institutionalized act of cruelty, citizenship denied, rights stripped, lives marked for destruction by the mere accident of birth. For millions, the future became a narrowing corridor, closing in with every new decree. It was not enough to blame traitors or weaklings. Hitler claimed the very blood of a people could be poisoned, their fate preordained in the twisted ledger of racial science. The ghettos, the camps, the lists all grew from this root. The final solution did not spring from madness alone, but from cold calculation. Bureaucrats stamped forms, engineers designed ovens, soldiers manned trains, all acting on decisions made in gilded chambers. These decisions reshaped the world with a cruelty that the mind recoils from. The invasion of Poland, planned with surgical detail, ignited the conflagration of World War II. Hitler's gamble in Russia, launched out of hubris and racial contempt, doomed millions on icy steppes and in burning cities. His armies rampaged, leaving behind them a new geography of suffering. But it was in the depths of occupied Europe that the most unforgivable choices were made. The Holocaust was not the act of a moment, but the sum of thousands of deliberate steps, a system of evil so vast it seemed to operate on the logic of apocalypse. The camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and others became the very embodiment of mechanized murder. At meetings like Wannsee, murder was mapped with bureaucratic precision. Genocide became an exercise in logistics. All the while, Hitler sat in his mountain fastness, increasingly removed from the bleeding world, growing more delusional with every passing day. As defeats multiplied, his orders became more irrational, his paranoia more consuming. Yet the machinery of death did not slow, it accelerated. Even as his empire crumbled, trains still ran to the east, children and elders alike crammed into cattle cars, fated for oblivion. There is a temptation to ascribe his acts to insanity, to hide from the fact that evil such as his was unwavering, systematic, and for its participants, dreadfully normal. Ordinary men and women by decision, cowardice, or self-interest became accomplices. Hitler's decisions shaped history, not because they were unthinkable, but because they were enacted, step by step, by those willing to carry them out. To gaze into these decisions is to confront the abyss, the point where humanity itself falters. The world had never seen such ruin wrought by a single will, nor such profound complicity. In Hitler's choices, we find the ultimate warning that the line between order and catastrophe, between righteousness and ruin, is as thin as the conscience of those who lead and as fragile as the courage of those who follow. Chapter 8. Reflections in Ruin, Understanding the Unforgivable. What is left when the monster falls? The ruins of Berlin stood as mute testament to the catastrophe Hitler unleashed, not only upon others, but upon those who followed him to the end. Eyes haunted by betrayal, mothers searching for lost children, soldiers limping home across shattered fields, a nation awakening to the dire cost of its devotion. The abyss had not vanished with Hitler's death. Its echoes lived on in every ruined home, every silent survivor. To understand the unforgivable, one must sit in these ruins and listen. The easy judgment evil, incomprehensible, offers comfort, but it risks blindness. Hitler was a monster, yes, but he rose not in a vacuum, and the horror of his crimes was magnified by every nod, every cheering crowd, and every averted gaze. The social collapse that followed the Reich was more than defeated armies and razed cities. It was the devastation of the spirit, the crackling of a moral universe that seemed, finally, beyond repair. The post-war years were spent in reckoning at Nuremberg and elsewhere. Humanity sought to draw a line, to declare never again. But reflection in the ruins goes deeper than regulation or judgment. It demands we ask uncomfortable questions. How did so many become complicit? How much evil was sown in ordinary hearts? Can such darkness be understood without being excused? Here, we grapple with the unfathomable. In trying to make sense of Hitler, we confront the capacity for darkness in the human soul. He is not a myth or a cautionary tale alone. He is the endpoint of 1,000 tiny failures of empathy, of vigilance, of resistance, accumulated and magnified until the world itself shudders. His mind, twisted beyond recognition, was only the spark. What followed was a conflagration of shared delusion. And yet, among the cinders, there are lessons to harvest. Evil is rarely born. It is cultivated, step by step, made possible by the silence of the many and the cruelty of the few. The ruins teach us that redemption, if it can exist, lies not in forgetting, but in ceaseless vigilance. To remember Hitler is not to honor him, but to keep the abyss in sight, to recognize the warning signs in our institutions, our leaders, and ourselves. To search the mind of a monster is to search the recesses of our own nature. We emerge from these ruins, scarred but more aware of our fragile dignity and the ease with which it can be lost. The abyss is always there, waiting for those who do not remember or who believe that monsters are born, not made. As the world rebuilt itself from ruin, it clung to this lesson. History is not an endless circle, but a path dotted with crossroads and perils. Each generation must ask, will we stand guard at the edge of the abyss, or allow ourselves to be led once more into its darkness? In the silence of the ruined city, an answer emerges, not of forgiveness for the unforgivable, but of resolve. To stare into the abyss is frightening. To step back from it, resisting not with hate, but with understanding, is the beginning of hope. For the future depends not on monsters, but on the courage of the rest of us to deny them the world they desire. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.